one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is, well, it goes beyond just religious and spiritual rituals and practices and experiences, but sexuality and the intersection between sexuality and spirituality really inundates all aspects of human life. And as you mentioned, it can be political, it can be social, it can be education, sports. I mean, all the different ways in which we kind of connect with people. But one of the really interesting ones, that I think a lot about, especially in the context of politics, is that a few years back I was involved in a think group that was looking at the idea of worship. And it occurred to me that there was this interesting parallel between sexuality and the hierarchy that arises in animals to the hierarchies that arise in human beings. And so in animals, in many species, there is either an alpha male or there is a queen bee of some kind. But the bottom line is that there's a hierarchical structure of the group, and there is one of the members is at the top. And in fact, everybody kind of has a little bit of a sense of where they fit in that hierarchy. But what's interesting in particular about the one at the very top is that one really kind of controls the overall structure of the group. And there is a sense of deference to that leader, that there is a sense of worship, if you will. And that becomes very fundamental because if one of the things that's kind of interesting to me about this is that when you have this alpha male, I'll just use that example, there may be a challenge to that alpha male. And if the challenger loses, theoretically, I always think, well, why don't they just challenge again? If they were close enough, maybe they could just do it again. But that becomes very destabilizing. And so usually if a challenger loses, they then kind of reduce themselves in terms of the hierarchical structure. And there needs to be a reasonable degree of stability at the top. Otherwise, the whole structure just never really, gets grounded and stays together. So now, take that to humanity and think about, the ancient civilizations and the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of, the Caesars of Rome and the kings of the ancient world, all the way up to the kings of medieval and almost modern time. There is a sense that they're worshipped. They're at this top of this hierarchy. If we keep, and there needs to be a certain degree of stability. In fact, just reflecting on the United States, if we had an election if we had to switch a president every 6 months, our country wouldn't work. I mean, there's just no way it would stay stable. The idea of having a president for 4 years or 8 years, it creates a stability that seems to be very, very important. So, it's just fascinating, looking at what's going on and saying, okay, well, this kind of makes sense. People kind of worship those leaders, and people get, as we see through the polls, the identification that people have, the connection that people have. And that's part of why you see, when you go to a political rally, they're ritualistic all the way, up and down, and they're singing songs and they're swaying in certain ways, and they make these impassioned speeches, and and they get people thinking about the ideas and the stories, and they tug at their emotions and so forth. So that really is real fundamental to how we as human beings work. And it really speaks to this idea of creating a kind of hierarchical structure with some member at the top that has to have a reasonable degree of stability, but also the ability to challenge that top. And so this is what we see. And of course, in my mind, part of why I got into all of this in the first place was, I was just always so struck by the fact that people had different religions, people believed in different political parties, and with such fervor and with such dedication, and they just absolutely knew that they were right and everyone else was wrong. It's pretty incredible when you think about that from a kind of philosophical perspective. And, as you mentioned at one point, some of my earliest thinkings on all of this came as a child, just like, well, if we're all looking at the same world, why don't we all see the things the same way? But we don't. And actually, when you actually think about the incredible complexities of our brain, that our genetics, how we were raised, what our parents were like, the friends we had, the teachers we had, the different good and bad experiences that we all had in our lives that bring us to today, it isn't a surprise that we all have different ideas and different thoughts about the world. As I often like to say, if there's 8 billion people on the planet, well, there's 8 billion religious belief systems, there's 8 billion political systems. No two people think of the world exactly the same way. And that's what this research also kind of bears out. But it helps us to understand it in the context of the rituals, the mythic stories that we fall to in order to understand our world, and the ways in which we interact with each other through these different kinds of ritualistic practices.